Evolution, as I mentioned, should really be a problem. I mean, it's as true as the fact that there are atoms that make up matter. It's as true as the fact that infectious diseases are caused by microorganisms, the germ theory. And yet, evolution is unique amongst all scientific facts and being opposed by a lot of people. Yeah, I'm here to talk about a book that I wrote called Why Evolution is True. And there's a specific reason I wrote it, and it's, although what I'm going to be talking about tonight is facts, the motivation for what I'm talking about is largely faith, in particular faith-based opposition to evolution, which is pretty rife in the United States. So let me give you, first of all, an indication of the problem. Here's a graph that appeared about a decade ago in the magazine Science, showing amongst 34 so-called advanced countries, the proportion of people in each country, you can see the countries on the left, who accepted evolution, as indicated by the length of the blue bar, who weren't quite sure whether or not evolution was true, which is the sort of yellowish bar, and then who thought evolution was false on the red bar. So by looking across at each country, ranging from Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, they're all rated in terms of decreasing acceptance of evolution. You could look at any one country and see how it stands up in relation to this theory. Well, where's the United States? We're right there. Out of 34 countries, we're number 33, right above Turkey in terms of acceptance of evolution. It's a pretty bad situation. It's as if, because as I'm going to try to convince you tonight, evolution is a scientific fact, it's as if you surveyed all these countries and asked them whether atoms existed, which is also a scientific fact, and about 60% of Americans weren't quite sure whether atoms existed or not, and only 40% of them said yeah. So this is a pretty dire situation, and it's a situation which was one of the motivations for me writing this book about what the evidence for evolution really is. One of the reasons we're so low, and I'll talk a little bit about this at the end of my talk, in the ranking of countries that accept evolution, is because we have all this opposition to evolution, which is largely derived from religious organizations, in particular fundamentalist organizations, but not completely fundamentalist organizations. You may remember a couple of years ago this trial in Dover, Pennsylvania, where intelligent design, which is a thinly disguised version of creationism, was supposed to be taught in the public high school, and it caused this huge court case, and it was thrown out, fortunately, by Judge Jones. But this problem keeps cropping up again and again. It's like the Hydra. When you cut off one head, another one grows in its place. So the problem of religiously motivated anti-evolutionism is pretty common and recurring in this country. The statistics I gave you in the last slide have held pretty steady for about 25 years. So it's not like we're getting more intelligent about what evolution is and whether it's true or not. So I hoped, because of this opposition to evolution, that maybe by acquainting people with the facts and why scientists really do think that evolution is a well-established fact, I hope by giving the evidence for evolution, that may be a vain hope, that people would at least maybe be a little bit more open-minded about it. Those on the fence might welcome it, and those who already accepted evolution might get some evidence or some ammunition from this book to bolster their case. Evolution, as I mentioned, should really be a problem. I mean, it's as true as the fact that there are atoms that make up matter. It's as true as the fact that infectious diseases are caused by microorganisms, the germ theory. And yet, evolution is unique amongst all scientific facts and being opposed by a lot of people, not only in this country, but at others. So what I'm going to do is tell you, first of all, the book is called Why Evolution is True. I'm going to tell you what scientific truth really is. What do we mean when we say something is true in science? I want to tell you what a theory is, because evolution is called a theory of evolution. It's often dismissed as being only a theory, as if a theory was just a wild speculation. I'll tell you what a scientific theory is and how we determine whether a scientific theory really is true or not. Then I'll tell you what the theory of evolution is, which is not just one thing. It's actually a conglomerate of different statements. And finally, in the bulk of this talk, will consist of giving you the evidence why the theory of evolution is true in the sense in which scientists believe that it's true. So first of all, what do we mean in science when we say something's true? Nothing is ever established beyond absolute doubt in science. There's always some, possibility of doubt. So what we mean when we say that something is true in science is simply this, and this comes from Stephen Jay Gould's definition of a scientific fact. It's an assertion for which there is so much evidence that it would be perverse to deny it. Okay? And this doesn't say anything about it. It has to be absolutely true and never being able to overturn. It just means that there's so much evidence behind this view that you'd have to be dumb or foolish or retarded or whatever to deny it. Okay? So what are some scientific facts in this light? First of all, there's the fact of atoms. Okay, that atoms exist. Now, it's possible that matter might not be made of atoms, and we've all been fooled, but there's so much evidence for the atomic structure of matter that you would be perverse to deny it. Similarly, the so-called germ theory of disease, that infectious diseases are caused by microorganisms, like protozoans and viruses and bacteria, that's also a scientific fact, because there's just so much evidence for it that you'd have to be really blinkered or perverse to deny it. And finally, and I put evolution in this class because I'll hope to convince you that it belongs in this class, the idea of evolution itself is true. We have as much evidence for evolution as we do for the germ theory of disease and for the atomic theory. Okay. So, evolution is often called just a theory, as I said. I'll tell you what the theory of evolution really states before, but that's to dismiss it on the grounds that it's a theory is to misunderstand what scientists really mean when they say a scientific theory. By a theory, we don't mean idle speculation or a guess in the sense of the Cubs are going to win the pennant this year. I mean, that's an idle speculation. It's also bad speculation, but it's one in which there's not a lot of substantive evidence behind it. In science, a theory is different from that parlance that people use. It's a coherent group of propositions made to explain facts about the world. Scientists are faced with a number of facts around the world. They raise theories to try to explain those facts. And they're not idle speculations. They're theories that are well supported by either logic and rigor and some evidence. So here's an example of 3 scientific theories. Each of these is meant to explain a number of facts about the real world, and they're all called theories. So there's the atomic theory, matter is made of atoms, and those atoms combine in particular ways. The germ theory of disease, which I've just mentioned to you before, and the theory of evolution. Okay, those are all theories in the sense that they're coherent propositions meant to explain, for example, in the case of atomic theory, the structure of matter. In the case of germ theory, the fact that you get infected, and when you kill the bug that infects you, you get better. And evolution theory, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Now, a theory can also be a fact at the same time, and this is important in trying to understand why evolution is both a theory and a fact. When it was proposed in 1859 by Darwin, evolution really did have the status of sort of a hypothesis. There was some evidence supporting it, not a ton, enough that it was pretty convincing. But in 150 years, so much data has been gathered, and it continues to be gathered with the finding of more fossils, with sequencing of genomes and things like that, that a theory basically graduates to what we call facthood over time. Evolution is no longer just a hypothesis or just a theory. There's so much evidence supporting it that it has become a fact. So when you hear the evolution dismissed by creationists as only a theory, that's based on 2 misunderstandings. First of all, of the nature of the word theory itself, and second of all, it's a misunderstanding of how a theory can also be a fact at the same time. Okay, so the important thing is to remember that theories can be facts at the same time. So what is the theory of evolution? It's called a theory. I'm going to try to convince you it's a fact. And the theory of evolution is not just one thing. It actually consists of at least 5 separate parts, some of which are connected intimately, others of which are more or less independent of the others. So this is the sort of professorial aspect of this talk I'll go through very quickly before we get to the interesting data. What is the theory of evolution? It's often called Darwinism or neo-Darwinism now in light of genetic discoveries. It consists of 5 propositions. First of all, that evolution happens. Okay? And what we mean by evolution is things change over time. Populations change over time, and by change we mean genetic change. Okay? So that's what evolution is, genetic change over time. If species change over time genetically, then you've demonstrated one aspect of Darwin's theory, things evolve. Forget this is actually number 2. Second of all, that evolution usually happens fairly gradually. That is, one species does not change into something very different overnight or even in 5 years or 10 years. It takes hundreds, thousands, sometimes millions of years to affect significant change of an organism. Okay, so this is another proposition that Darwin had. And those are somewhat independent. You can have evolution, but it's possible that it would happen overnight. that a dinosaur would lay an egg that gave rise to a bird. But that's not the way it happened, okay? But you can see that they're not completely connected to one another. Each one of these propositions has to be demonstrated independently if you're going to say the whole bag is true. Third of all, there's speciation that occurs. This is the area, as Beth said, that I work on. And that's the idea that lineages split over time. One thing evolves and changes, but it can also give rise to something else. And this can happen over and over again, and the result is you get this branching tree of life. And we have about 50 million species now, all of them descended from the single ancestral species that lived about 3.5 billion years ago. Okay, and this is something that has to be demonstrated separately from the first two propositions. The number 4, which is sort of the flip side of number 3, is that if things split, then if you trace them back, like if you trace branches back, they're going to intersect at a node, and that node is the common ancestor that gave rise to those two species. So again, part 4 is that species share a common ancestry. And in fact, every pair of species on Earth, be it humans versus frogs or ferns versus rabbits, share a common ancestor at some time in the past. More closely related species share that ancestor more recently in the past. Okay. And finally, much of the evolutionary change that we see is driven by this force that Darwin first suggested, called natural selection, so-called survival of the fittest. It is probably the predominant force that causes evolutionary change, and it is the only known force. It's not really a force, it's a process. It's the only known process that can explain why organisms appear to be designed to fit their environments. That appearance of design, that before Darwin was imputed to the benevolence and foresight of a deity. Okay. Now you can see number 5 is independent of all the rest. You can have evolution, common descent, speciation, gradualness, but it doesn't have to be caused by natural selection. There are other things that could cause evolutionary change. So again, number 5 has to be demonstrated too. So I've put forth 5 propositions that altogether make up what we call evolutionary theory, and now what I have to do is give you the evidence that shows that every one of those is correct. Okay? That's a tall order, but it happens to be true. In fact, every piece of evidence that we have collected since Darwin supports the theory of evolution. We have not a single piece of evidence out of the millions and millions of pieces of evidence that we have that says that evolution is wrong, or that any one of these propositions is wrong. That's as close as we can get to a true theory in science. Okay, so now I'll just give you the data, the facts that make us think that evolution is true. And they divide into 2 classes. The first one is called predictions. That is, if the 5 propositions I gave you before are true, then we can predict that we'll see some stuff about life in the Earth. The other group, which I call retrodictions, are things that you can't necessarily predict from what I said before, but things that only make sense in hindsight if evolution were the process driving the origin and diversification of life. Okay, so first of all, if life originated on Earth in the distant past, and Darwin and the rest of us now think that there was only a single original species that did that for reasons I won't go into, then we should see that the first detectable traces of life on Earth would be very simple forms. After all, if life came out of non-life, then it had to start fairly simply. It couldn't start with humans, for example, because self-assembly of molecules and stuff does not produce complex organisms right at the outset. And only later, after evolution kicked in, would you get those more complex forms. So that's simple prediction number 1 from evolutionary theory. Things start off simple, just as predicted, and they get more and more complex. Now, there's not a drive to complexity. We still have bacteria, we still have early fishes, and we still have plants. It's just that the most complex forms get more complex over time. So what you see is exactly what you predict. If evolution started with some simple molecules, simple replicating molecules, and then evolved into different forms, and some of them becoming more complex. Okay, here's another prediction. If evolution occurs within lineages, and they change over time, and things split through the process of speciation, then we should be able to find examples in the fossil record, not only of gradual change over time, but of things splitting. Okay, in the fossils. Okay, that's a simple prediction. We should be able to see evolution in the rocks. Now, granted, the fossil record is not perfect. In fact, we only know of less than 1% of the species that ever lived on our planet. Less than 1 in 100, probably more like 1 in 10,000. We still have enough fossils to amply demonstrate that both evolution and splitting have happened. Okay, here's one example. This is a a marine plankton, a diatom, these small one-celled marine organisms. When they die, they fall to the seafloor, so you can actually just drill a core through the floor of the sea and get an evolutionary time slice. And bear with me, I have a cold. You can see, this is one of them over a period of several million years. You can see that there's been some evolutionary change in this species of diatom. Sometimes it gets bigger, sometimes it gets smaller. It's evolution, it's not very impressive. But I've left out one part of the core, and that's this. If you dig down, somewhere about 3 million years ago, that one lineage becomes two. It actually forms a new species, which becomes smaller. So the two species diverge in body size, probably because they're competing with each other for food and have to occupy different niches. So what we see here is not only evolutionary change, but we also see that splitting. That's part of the theory of evolution as well. This is a one-celled organism, so you might not be that impressed. If you want something more complicated, here's one, the horse. Horses evolved in Western North America. They went extinct and were reintroduced by European conquerors. But they did evolve here in the Western United States. And fossil record shows both the branching of these lineages. You can see all the different branches in horse evolution here, but also within certain branches there's been this kind of evolutionary change. The original horse, Hyracotherium, which is a small sort of collie-sized animal, had 5 toes, and then over time you can see in several lineages that the toes gradually disappear. First one goes, then the other, then the 2 middle toes disappear, and you're left with the hoof, which is simply the middle toe of what used to be the ancestral horse. So horses are running on their middle toes now. And this is evolutionary change. They also got larger, as you can see from the diagram, and their teeth got bigger, probably because they had to deal with the grasses that were replacing leaves in the Great Basin at the time. It's a lot harder to eat grass than to eat leaves. You need bigger teeth with lots of ridges to chomp that silica-laden grass. So here we have, again, an example of evolutionary change within lineages, but also the splitting of an ancestral lineage into many different ones, some of which went extinct. Okay, and I'm not going to bore you with all the examples we have of this kind of change. I mean, I could give you 400 or 500 slides of this kind of stuff, but take my word for it, they're there, and some of them are documented in my book. Another prediction you can make is number 4 on the list of evolutionary tenets. If creatures share a common ancestry, as we think they do, and as Darwin posited, then we should be able to find transitional forms that connect modern groups to their common ancestors. So, for example, biologists have told us, and in Darwin's time they thought so, based on similarities in physiology and anatomy, morphology, that birds and reptiles were pretty closely related. Okay, I mean, you may not think that, but if you do the anatomy and you're an expert, you can see that they look to be pretty closely related. So, if evolution were true, then they must have had a common ancestor sometime in the past. So we should be able to find that, right, in the fossil record. Well, it's not quite that simple, because finding a common ancestor means finding the single species that gave rise to all modern reptiles on the one hand and all modern birds on the other. There's only one species that did that. That's what we mean by a common ancestor or a missing link. And to find a single specified species in the fossil record, given that we only know about 1 out of every 10,000 species that ever lived, is almost impossible. So this task of showing that there's one common ancestor that links these two groups is almost an insuperable task. But that doesn't mean that we can't find evidence anyway, because even though we can't find a single species, by the way, it would have looked just like a reptile. It's just given rise to modern reptiles, and then one of those branches would have given rise to birds. We should be able to find, if birds evolved from reptiles, which we think they did, transitional forms showing the change from an early reptilian type of animal to a later bird-like animal. Okay? That's a prediction. And we may not be able to find that one existing species, but we sure should be able to find some species along that branch, early birds that looked more reptilian. And sure enough, you can find them. Actually, one was known in Darwin's time, Archaeopteryx, but they didn't realize the significance of it. In the last 10 or 15 years, however, including this week, a paper published in Nature, scientists, especially in China, have been turning up these early birds that look for all the world like dinosaurs. They are dinosaurs. They're theropod dinosaurs. And we now know without any doubt at all that birds evolved from dinosaurs, that those feathers started off as little filaments on an otherwise normal dinosaur. The feathers got bigger and bigger and bigger. They were probably there for thermoregulation. rather than for flight. And when they got to be a certain size, they enabled the bird to glide and then to fly. So here's an example of a transitional form. The intermediacy is not just in appearance, but it's also in time, which is very important. If this thing had occurred 20 or 30 million years ago instead of 120 million years ago, it would not be a good piece of evidence for a transitional form. It probably looks something like that. Pretty scary, unable to fly, but it was a feathered dinosaur. Even T-Rex, scientists now think, was covered with fluff, so it's not quite as fearsome as the movies make it out to be. Other transitional forms that have been found within the last 20 or 30 years are those in whales. Scientists have told us that whales evolved from land animals that were artiodactyls, split-toed animals, like pigs and hippos, and it happened about 50 million years ago. Now, when I was a kid, creationists would laugh at scientists for saying this and say, well, you told me a land animal has turned into a whale. How could that possibly happen? What would the intermediate form look like? Dwayne Gish, a creationist whose lecture I went to when I was in high school, showed a picture of a cow standing on the edge of the water. Actually, it wasn't a cow. It was an animal. The front half was a cow, and the rear half was a fish. It was like a mercow, and the animal was standing there with a question mark over its head. And he said, well, how could the scientists tell us that this transition could happen? That's ludicrous, isn't it? And all the people in the audience, said, yeah, scientists are all stupid. How could they really think that? But it's really dangerous to say that because something sounds foolish, it couldn't have happened. Because in the interim, and this again has happened in the last 20 or 30 years, we found a number of transitional forms of fossils that occur at the right time, about 40 to 50 million years ago, and show a gradual change of a land-dwelling animal, like the one at the top, a small sort of deer-like animal. You can look on YouTube and see the water chevrotain of Southeast Asia. It's a deer-like animal, but it jumps in the water when it's frightened and swims underwater for a long time. And gradually we see fossils in which the thing develops webbed feet. It starts to lose its hind limbs. The nostrils move towards the top of the head to form a blowhole. Its front limbs become a paddle. It develops a tail. And finally we get the modern whales. And we have this excellent fossil sequence. Here's one of the creatures, Rhodocetus, showing that it's sort of an amphibious creature. This is not an animal whose front half is a cow and rear half is a fish. It's an animal that's sort of amphibious in the same way that a hippopotamus is amphibious and perfectly suited to the transition between land and water. Okay, so a prediction that was made by biologists in Darwin's time has been verified, but only in the last quarter century or so. It shows a complete sequence of changes of one thing to another, and this is a major change in the history of life. It's the return to the sea of mammals, okay? It only took 10 million years for this to happen, to go from the top to the bottom. That's not very long, given that it took us 7 million years to go from our ancestor with the chimpanzees to a fairly similar creature that's us today. Okay, now there's this whole class of observations about nature which are not predicted from the theory of evolution, but can be made sense of only if you think organisms did evolve. This is what I call retrodictions, things that make sense only in light of evolution. There's a number of puzzling phenomena in biology that fall under this rubric of things that don't make sense, except in light of evolution. Here's one of them. This is the embryo of a spotted dolphin. It's another animal that used to be terrestrial. Its ancestors that went back to the water at the age of 24 days. And you can see it looks pretty much like a human fetus, if you've seen a human fetus. In fact, all mammalian fetuses look pretty much the same early on. And they look like fish fetuses, too, which is another clue that we evolved from fish. But look at the limb buds on this thing. Sorry, let me go backwards. It has a forelimb bud up at the front, which is destined to become the paddle that these dolphins have. But it also has this hind limb bud, which is labeled H at the bottom. Now, if you looked at a human embryo or a turtle embryo or any kind of thing that has 4 legs, you're going to see exactly the same thing. It develops a bud where the front limbs come out and a bud where the rear limbs come out. But the thing about dolphins is they don't have any rear limbs, okay? So this thing, which in all related species goes on to develop into a leg, goes away. Here's the spotted dolphin at 48 days, and that hind limb bud, which started to form, has gone away. It's disappeared, it's regressed, whereas the forelimb is going on to develop into a paddle. Now you ask yourself, why is that? Under a creationist scenario, if you think that life was designed or a providential creator made these features, why would the creator give a hind limb bud to an animal that doesn't have hind limbs at a certain stage of development and then take it away again? Okay? It's of no use whatsoever. And, sorry, that hind limb bud looks exactly like the hind limb bud of animals that do go on to have legs. So the only possible explanation of this is that dolphins are related to animals that had 4 limbs, and they start to show that early in their development, but then they abort that hind limb. They still have the genetic information for making legs, but they get rid of it because they've evolved to not have legs. Okay? Something that makes sense in light of evolution doesn't make sense under any other theory. Here's another retrodiction. This is something that happened to all of us, including you and me. When we're 6 months old in the womb, we develop a coat of hair called lanugo. Any of you know about this? Okay, parents might know about this. Occasionally some babies are born with this, especially if they're premature. It usually develops at about 6 months. Here's an example of a sort of fuzzy baby being born. That coat of hair usually disappears in the womb shortly after it's formed at about 6 months. And occasionally it's present in a newborn, but it quickly drops off and the baby is a naked ape just like the rest of us. Now, why is that there? Okay. It develops in the womb, as I said, at about 6 months, but it can't possibly serve to keep us warm in there because, first of all, we're floating around in liquid. Second of all, it's plenty warm in there. We don't need fur. It's 98.6, and being a furry baby is not going to keep you any warmer in the womb than if you didn't have fur. It turns out that if you look at chimpanzees or any of our relatives at the same stage of development, they start to develop a coat of hair at exactly the same stage of development, but in their case, they don't get rid of it. Young chimps and gorillas are born fully furred. They keep that lanugo, and it turns into the coat of fur. So the fact that we develop it in utero and then get rid of it makes eminent sense if we're descended from furry animals and we still contain some of the genetic instructions for making that fur, but we just don't carry them through. It makes no sense under the alternative scenario that this is somehow the product of an intelligent designer. It's not very intelligent. Another retrodiction of vestigial organs. If you look at a skeleton of a whale, I'm not sure if they still have one of these in the Field Museum, but frequently if you look at an articulated whale skeleton, and here's one of a gray whale, you'll see that connected, or not connected, but hanging from the vertebral skeleton at the rear are these pair of bones, or sometimes it's a single bone. And if you look at that closely, it looks like a rudimentary pelvis and rudimentary sort of shrunken hind legs. Now it's of no function at all for this animal in the skeleton because as you see it's not connected to the rest of the skeleton. These are just bones embedded in the flesh of a whale. What this is, in fact, is the vestigial pelvis. Why is it there? It's there because whales, as I said before, are the descendants of 4-legged animals that came back to the sea. They've gotten rid of their hind legs, but we still see a little bit of hind leg and pelvis left, almost to remind us that these things really were, at one point, hind limbs. And occasionally, as with the spotted dolphin, you'll see them, the development will go a little bit askew. And 1 out of every 500 baleen whales, for example, and this is a baleen whale, will actually develop the legs a little bit more fully. So here's the bones. You see the scale there, that's 1 foot. So this thing is about 2.5 feet long, sticking outside of the whale. And you can see the femur, the tibia, and some of the tarsal bones of these things. So it's recognizably a leg. It doesn't do much, it's just sort of a developmental anomaly in a few individuals. But what it shows is that some of the genetic instructions for making legs are still there and can be activated by some developmental anomaly, but usually are not because it's not useful for these things to be there. Again, this makes sense only in light of evolution. It makes no sense in light of the idea that whales were created along with everything else as a simple creature. Now, one of the predictions you can make from seeing these sort of vestigial organs is that the vestigial genes are there. If a whale has legs, then there still must be genes in its DNA that tells it to make something like a leg, even though something has happened to those genes to turn them off. When genes are deactivated during evolution, they're not simply removed from the genome, they're just silenced by mutations, okay? So we can predict that in some animals and plants, we will be able to find genes that were useful in their ancestors but are no longer useful because they've been silenced. And now that we can sequence the genomes of species, we find lots and lots of these. Here's one of them that was actually just published last year. That's a human embryo at the age of about 4 weeks. Now what is that balloon sticking out from its belly? That's where the egg yolk would be if you were a chicken. Okay, if you see a chicken embryo, that thing is full of yolk to nourish the animal in the egg. Well, humans don't need to be nourished through a yolk because we have the placenta. It's the mother that nourishes the baby. Nevertheless, they still produce a yolk sac. Doesn't do anything. This thing is completely functionless. It's empty, but it's still there. Okay, why is it there? It's a sort of, it's not there for any purpose. It's there because it's the non-functional remnant of a trait that we inherited from our ancestors. But okay, that's the yolk sac. But what is even more interesting is if you look at the DNA in humans, so we know this now because it's just been sequenced, the human genome, we find that there are 3 genes for making egg yolk in our own DNA. Every single one of those genes has been silenced by mutations. So we have the genes that if they were active could make yolk to fill that sac, but they don't. Okay. Now what is the explanation of that? Why are we carrying this genetic baggage with us that normally in our relatives, those genes will make egg yolk to fill that sac? What else can we conclude except that we are the descendants of creatures that lived in eggs and had yolk? It's not just the egg yolk genes that we carry around with us. There's lots of genes in our DNA that don't do anything but testify to our ancestry. Genes for making vitamin C. Every other mammal on Earth, practically, except for the guinea pig, can make its own vitamin C. We can't. We have to get it from orange juice and milk and stuff. If you look at our genome, we have all the genes necessary to make vitamin C, but the last step of the pathway, the gene is rendered kaput, so we can't. And it's probably because our ancestors got lots of vitamin C from eating fruit and we didn't need that pathway. Nevertheless, what other explanation could there be for this dead genes? Olfactory receptor genes, I won't talk about those. Another interesting one that was found just recently, how many of you have cats? Raise your hand if have cats. How many of you think your cats can taste sweet things? Any of you? Well, the answer is they can't taste sweet things. If the cat eats ice cream, it's because it likes the sort of dairy product of it. Cats cannot taste sugar. They've lost their ability to do that, but if you look at the cat genome, cats have the receptor gene for detecting sweetness, but it's broken. Okay. Cats didn't need to taste sweetness because their prey is not sweet, so there's no need for them to seek out sweet foods. They eat meat. So nevertheless, they still carry this genetic baggage in the cat genome. And this is over and over again. You see this in all kinds of organisms. They carry dead genes that were useful in ancestors. Okay. Finally, the last thing that I want to talk about as evidence of evolution is a retrodiction, something that makes sense only in light of evolution, from the realm of biogeography, which is the study of the distribution of plants and animals on the surface of the earth. And if you look at the distribution of these animals and plants, there's a lot of peculiarities in them that don't make sense unless you think that animals and plants evolved. This is so important to Darwin that he included 2 chapters on biogeography and the origin of species, unlike most of the other areas of evidence. I won't talk about much of it, but I do want to mention the one thing, since I just got back from the Galapagos, which is the distribution of life on oceanic islands. Oceanic islands are those islands that when they were formed rose above the sea, de novo, bereft of life, usually through volcanoes that divided them up, that thrust them up above the sea. The Galapagos are volcanic islands, the Hawaiian Islands are volcanic, lots of the islands and atolls in the South Pacific are volcanic. And if you look at these volcanic islands, as Darwin did in The Origin, you find that there are several peculiarities about the kinds of plants and animals you see in them. The most striking thing, and any of you that have been to Hawaii or to the Galapagos or the South Pacific will notice, is that there are no endemic mammals on any of these islands, or amphibians or freshwater fish. The Hawaiian Islands are plenty big, but there's not a single endemic mammal on all of that land. There's not a single endemic amphibian on Hawaii or the Galapagos, and there's not a single endemic freshwater fish, even though there's plenty of fresh water on all of these islands. Okay, now why is that? These islands seem to be missing major groups of life that you see in other places. You see these on continents, and you see them on continental islands, islands like Great Britain or Madagascar, or the Aleutians, islands that used to be connected to the mainland. But on these islands that were formed beneath this and came up from beneath the sea, you don't see this kind of stuff. Okay, so how do you explain that? Well, if you're a creationist, you might say, oh, God put these things there, and obviously amphibians, freshwater fish, and mammals can't live on these islands. They don't do well there, and so the Creator didn't put them there. Well, Darwin was smart enough to see through that objection, and he simply pointed out that if you put the animals on the islands through introduction by humans, they do fine. So if you lived in Hawaii, you'll probably know that the cane toad, for example, an introduced amphibian, is doing very well. eating the local cats and dogs and poisoning the rest of them. It's so bad that they want to extirpate it. The Indian mongoose has invaded Hawaii. I think it was introduced to control snakes, which were introduced to control something else, and the mongoose is doing fine. So the fact that these kinds of animals are missing from islands cannot be explained by the fact that they can't do well there. They can. Somehow they just didn't get there in the first place. And that's the key to this imbalanced nature of life on islands. You don't see many mammals, reptiles, or freshwater fish. In fact, hardly any. But what you find is plenty of plants, birds, and insects. Okay. In the Galapagos, where I just was, tons of insects, lots of birds, endemic birds like the Galapagos finches and mockingbirds, and lots of plants, cactuses, sunflowers, etc. What's the difference? One kind of organism can get there over water. Plants can float, birds can fly, insects can be blown by wind or fly to these islands and evolve into new species. Mammals, freshwater fish, and reptiles have no way to cross vast expanses of ocean to get to the islands. And finally, the last key to this puzzle is that if you look at the kinds of life present on these oceanic islands and see where in the world the most similar kinds of fauna are, it's almost invariably on the nearest mainland. So if you stand in the Galapagos and you look at the iguanas and you look at the plants and you look at the cactuses and you look at the birds and you say, well, where in the world can I find birds that are most similar to these? It's on the west coast of South America, the nearest mainland. Okay, same thing with Hawaii. So how do you explain all this? There's no way in the world, and in fact I've never heard creationists try to explain all this data, to explain this except by saying that what you find on these islands are the descendants of things that got there through accidental dispersal, explaining why you get insects, plants, and birds, and not very much of anything else, and then form new species once they got there. So we have this high level of endemism on islands. So I won't go into, there's books and books written about biogeography and evolution. This is just one fact that supports it. Two more aspects of evolution that can't be explained by creationism, at least not if the creator is a beneficent one, or what I call bad design. And organisms are loaded with features that just don't make sense if you think they were designed by any kind of designer, not necessarily a beneficent one, but one that had efficiency or optimal design in mind. If you're an aging male like myself, this is the first one that comes to mind. That's your prostate gland. The prostate gland is curious. It's an organ. It makes seminal fluid, the fluid that accompanies your sperm, and you can see where it is located on the left there. Okay, surrounding the urethra. Okay, which is the tube where your urine goes through, comes out the penis there. So that's all fine and good, except that if you get to be an older male, you frequently experience swelling of that prostate gland. As the prostate gland swells, it squeezes that urethra closed. This is why old men have trouble urinating. And you can see these ads on television if you watch the news, which is aimed at a demographic of about 50 to 60, that this is what you have to take Flomax or whatever it's called because your prostate gland is enlarging. Now, what kind of designer would put an organ prone to swelling around a collapsible tube? Okay, it just doesn't make any sense at all. You'd put it outside the tube, okay? Robin Williams, in one of his more forgettable movies, discusses this situation and compares this to somebody putting a sewage pipe through a playground, okay? So it doesn't make sense if you think the designer is optimal. Either you think the designer is beneficent or you think he has a particular hatred of men over the age of 50. But whatever, this is not optimal design. But it makes sense in light of evolution because we know from other considerations, such as developmental biology, that the prostate gland evolved from the walls of the urethra. Those walls evolved into a surrounding gland, and so that's why the tube runs through the gland. It's an evolutionary explanation. It doesn't make sense in light of creationism. And in fact, we're plagued by all kinds of horrible remnants of evolution, our bad backs, our wisdom teeth, the horrible painful childbirth that women have to go through. All of this stuff is simply stuff that a beneficent and intelligent and efficient creator would not have given us. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk about very briefly is natural selection here. And that is, so I've hoped I've convinced you that evolution, common ancestry, splitting, gradualism, and all that stuff is true. What about the cause of that, natural selection? Okay, can we get any evidence for natural selection at all? And the prediction is that if evolution did result from natural selection, then we should be able to see it operating in nature, at least sometimes. And in fact, that's true. We've identified more than 300 cases, including changes that we can see with our own eyes. So, These are all the areas of biology that we have evidence for natural selection, for evolution, for gradual change, for common ancestry, and for splitting. First of all, the fossil record. Vestigial organs such as the pelvis of the whale. Quirks of development. The fact that we get a lanugo and it goes away at 6 months. Bad design, the prostate gland. Biogeography, the distribution of life on islands. We see examples of natural selection in real time. All of these document every one of those 5 tenets of evolutionary theory that I talked about at the beginning. So we know that all of these have happened. What else can we conclude? That there's so much evidence for evolution that it would be perverse to deny it. In other words, that evolution is true in the sense of scientific truth. You'd have a hard time saying that these things don't prove evolution is true in the scientific sense. But it goes further than that. There's also a number of possible observations that you could have made that would disprove evolution. Okay, here's a list of them that I've made. Just a few of them. I could make the list a lot longer. If we found one species, for example, doing something that was only good for a second species, if we found that there's a general lack of genetic variation, if organisms were not responsive to artificial selection, all of that would demonstrate that evolution was false. And I can write any number of these observations. Any fossil in the wrong place. If we found a human fossil in sediments 500 million years old, we'd say, well, evolution must be wrong because that fossil shouldn't be there. The fact is we don't have any fossils like that, nor have we seen any of these other observations that could disprove evolution. So not only do we have everything that confirms evolution, but we see a notable lack of the things that we could see that would disprove it. So as far as I'm concerned, this sort of closes the case for evolution. We really don't need any more evidence, at least at the time being. It is a true proposition. Okay. Given that, why are we so low on the national scale? I mean, given that we have all this evidence, and this is not obscure stuff, there's books and books that are written that you can go to easily and read about all this stuff. Why are Americans so resistant to evolution? Why are only 40% of us, actually about 35 in this graph, willing to say that evolution is true, whereas almost 50% say it's not true? And maybe another 10 or 20% don't know for sure. Okay. Well, as I intimated at the beginning, that's probably one explanation right there. Religion is something that brings an impediment to understanding, or not necessarily understanding, but to accepting evolution. And it is one reason, perhaps, that the United States is so low on the number of countries that accept evolution. Okay? Now, why do I say that? Well, it's because of the evidence. If you take those 34 countries, these ones listed on the left, and you go to an independent data source, which is the United Nations, and look at the number of people in each country that are religious, and by religious I mean say that they believe in the existence of God, and then you plot those, there's a definite, this is a statistically very striking, negative relationship between belief in God and acceptance of evolution. The countries that have high acceptance of evolution on the left, upper left, are those that tend to have less belief in God. Those are countries like France, like Norway, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, etc. The countries on the right, over in the right scale, that have high belief in God also tend in general to have low acceptance of evolution. Those are countries like Turkey, there's us, second lowest, Lithuania, Italy, etc. So there's this definite negative correlation. Now what does this mean? Well, first of all, this is a correlation, it's not a causation. And you can interpret this, even if this was a causal relationship, in either of two ways. Either the more you believe in God, the less resistant it makes you to accepting evolution, or the more you learn about evolution, the less likely it makes you to be religious, okay, or both. Okay, and undoubtedly I think both of those probably act to some extent, but I think probably if there is a causal relationship here, it is that the more religious you are, the less likely you are to embrace evolution. Simply because most people don't have the opportunity to accept Darwinism and give up evolution and give up religion on that basis. Second of all, there's independent statistics showing that there's this big clash in people's minds between religious faith and evolution. I'm not saying that religious people cannot accept evolution here. What I'm saying is that there is, in the statistics, a negative relationship between the acceptance of one and the other. There was a Newsweek poll taken last year where they asked religious Americans, if there was a scientific fact that was discovered that showed that one of your religious beliefs was wrong, what would you do? Would you give up the religious belief, that particular religious belief, would you deny the scientific fact or whatever? And it turned out that 63% of Americans said they would deny the scientific fact in order to save their religious belief. So that's an obvious indicator, I think, of what is going on here. So if you're determined, like me, to try to make people accept evolution, or not make them, but show them that it's good for them to accept evolution, good in the sense that your life is richer, you understand where we came from, you know, things are you have an increased wonder at the universe, then you might be tempted to think, well, maybe in order to do that, we'll have to make them less religious, okay? In order to take them on the left of this graph so you can go up to Darwinism. It turns out that you have to give up about 35% of your acceptance of God to get 10% more acceptance of Darwin. That's what it's sort of flat. So it's a long road to hoe. And these kind of statistics, I think, explain why people like Richard Dawkins, for example, who has long tried to teach people evolution without budging the statistics one bit, has finally realized that maybe our enemy is not ignorance, our enemy is religion, at least in the United States. And so I think that's perhaps why he wrote this book, The God Delusion, which is an atheist book. His task became one, not of teaching people evolution, but of getting rid of religion to open the way for them to accept evolution. This is all speculation that I'm talking about now. I'm not. This is maybe just a correlation that has no causal influences, etc. But it does lead you to think that maybe we can't just teach people the facts, and maybe my writing that book was a futile thing to do, because you cannot give people facts and make them accept a scientific fact if their religious background tells them that that fact is not congenial to them. Okay, we may have to wait until America becomes less religious, until we see more people embracing Darwinism. Now people say, well, religion is always going to be with us. That's not going to happen. Well, it did happen in Europe. Norway, Sweden, and Denmark can be described pretty much as atheistic countries, but they didn't used to be. Okay. So you could. So maybe this is why Dawkins, and to a lesser extent people like myself, sort of want to loosen the hold of religion on this country, because it opens up our minds not only to evolution, but all kinds of things that involve rationality, vaccinations, stem cell research, things like that. But it may be a tough road to hoe, as I indicated. And because there's a correlation between religion and other things that may make the idea of just getting rid of religion or diminishing its hold on America not so easy to do. This is a graph that was published by Greg Paul. Let me see if I can get the date here. I think it was just a few years ago. Oh, there it is. It's on the slide. 2009. This was published last year. Looking at, I think, 17 countries, looking at the correlation between what they call how successful their societies are versus how much those people believe in God. And Paul's used the standard sociological index for a successful society, which is basically how secure the citizens feel within their society. It's based on things like incidence of homicide, abortions, a number of people in jail, whether there's good state medical care, things like that. So those on the left, we have these, going up, we have the highly successful societies, Japan, Norway, Denmark, etc. On the right, we have unsuccessful societies, and you can see the U there, that's us. And you can see the strong negative correlation between how successful. Now, this may look sort of paradoxical to you. I mean, aren't we a successful society? I mean, this is America, by God. We are successful. But if you look at the measures that they use of indexes of successful societies, which correlates with how secure the citizens feel, we don't do too well. We don't have very good medical care, for example, compared to a lot of these countries. We have a high incidence of abortion. We have a high incidence of criminality, lots of handgun use, lots of venereal disease, lots of suicide. There's another interpretation, however, which is that those people that believe, those countries that are more religious tend to construct less successful societies. It's because they don't like them. And you can think of Republicans opposing medical care or something like that as a way, or being religious might lead you, I mean, I don't know, that's one way to do it. So I think one way the correlation makes sense, the other one doesn't. But anyway, this is all speculation, but this is sort of the faith part and the fact versus faith that I wanted to get to. In order to loosen the grip of religion on American society, or in any society, to make way for not only evolution, but any form of rationality that contravenes religion, we may not just be able to write books on atheism. We may have to do things to change the society itself, to make the people feel more secure in a way that they don't need religion as a crutch to lean on. And that is a much more difficult undertaking, and in the end, however, I think it's a more nobler undertaking. Anyway, that's the speculation, and I'll end it here and be glad to take any questions. So. Thanks.